Welcome to the American Library in Paris. I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here. Welcome to Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. This evening, I'm very pleased to welcome back Don Doyle, who's spoken here before, and Denis Lacorne in conversation about Don's book, Don's book. Okay. Reconstruction. All right. Don Doyle is a retired professor of history who has taught at the University of South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and as a Fulbright professor in Rome, Genoa, and Rio de Janeiro. He has authored many books, among them The Cause of All Nations, an international history of the American Civil War, and The Age of Reconstruction, how Lincoln's new birth of freedom remade the world. And he lives in Folly Beach, South Carolina. Denis Lacorne is a French political scientist. He is Director of Research Emeritus at the Centre de Recherche Internationale at Sciences Po. A specialist in the United States, his research focuses on American elections, the construction of national identities, multiculturalism, and the politics of tolerance and secularism from a comparative perspective. His previous books in English are The Limits of Tolerance and Religion in America, and his next book, on a political history of races in America, will come out next March with Gallimard. These two distinguished historians will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to audience questions. Welcome, and thank you very much. Yes, a big round of applause.
So, Reconstruction, I imagine everyone knows what it is, but you may want to say, maybe a word to remind people what it is in American history. But what's wonderful about the book is, first of all, it's most innovative, I would say, and most ambitious, too. It goes well beyond our traditional understanding of Reconstruction in American history. And I read it with great pleasure. I was, of course, terribly impressed by the scope of the argument. Maybe we should start with the nature of your argument. What's very interesting about it is that you tell us, in your mind, there are really two reconstructions, domestic reconstructions, misunderstood by a particular school of history, the Dunning School of History, a famous professor at Columbia, but who had a rather peculiar reading of domestic reconstruction. And then you point to the critics of that approach. And the critics are Du Bois, they are, of course, Eric Foner. And then you have the other reconstruction, international reconstruction, which is truly the focus of your book. And in a way, it's a book about post-Civil War reconstruction, foreign policy, and the major architects of that post-Civil War foreign policy, the main one, but not just the only one, being, in fact, sorry, I just lost, William Seward, of course, and his successor, Hamilton Fish and others. So, in your word, what is international reconstruction? And here I'm going to quote you. You define it as anti-imperialists, anti-slavery, pro-democracy. And the major achievement, as you put it, is really to remove European empires from the American hemisphere and facilitate at the same time the decolonization of Canada, of British North America. So the first question that I'd like to ask is the following. In fact, how different is international reconstruction, the way you define it, from the Monroe doctrine? In what sense is it a modernization or an adaptation of the Monroe doctrine?
Thank you. That's a good start. The international reconstruction, as I see it, was foreign policy, focus on foreign policy, in an effort to make the world safe for the United States, but also for republicanism, the idea of democratic republics, government of the people, by the people, for the people, to coin a phrase. And the Monroe Doctrine had been coined in 1823. It was a warning against European imperialists from trying to take back their colonies, particularly the Spanish, trying to intervene in Mexico and other troubled republics that were just getting on their feet. But it really was it was a doctrine, it was there, it was in principle a threat that if you come in and try to establish further colonies or restore your lost colonies, the United States will consider that unfriendly. That's diplomatic language for we're going to go to war. But in fact, it was never enforced. And during the Civil War, Spain comes in and takes the Dominican Republic back into the empire. Spain, Britain, and France organize an allied invasion of Mexico.
Yeah, now, those are the three countries I'd like you to
Yes.
expand on. Yes.
Yes. And so they established the Maximilian regime. And if we look at the map in 1865, the United States is surrounded by these hostile European empires, never mind the Confederacy, which is devoted to secession, but also to undermining the United States, dividing it. You've got France and Mexico supporting this Austrian Archduke, Britain in Canada, which was neutral but not very friendly to the United States. There were Confederate terrorists that they were harboring in Montreal. They were raiding into Vermont, of all things, setting fires in New York, trying to create a general panic in New York just before the election of 1864. And then in Spain, the last slaveholding nation in Europe, they were committed to expanding and continuing slavery in Cuba, Puerto Rico. And after their misadventure in Mexico, Spain sent a fleet over to bully Peru and Chile into wars in South America. So it looked like they were trying to take things back. International Reconstruction was devoted to repelling them. And out of this discourse over Mexico comes what I call a new Monroe Doctrine. It's aggressive, it's muscular, and it's not just against further colonization. It says essentially that the Americas are for republicanism. This is a haven for republics. We don't want European empires here. We don't want monarchy here. They are inherently hostile to Republican principles, and this is going to be a Republican hemisphere. And Seward also posited that slavery is hostile to republicanism. Witness the recent Civil War, when Maximilian tried to bring Confederates into Mexico with their slaves. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, then commander of the army, put his foot down, and nearly.
Slavery is an important part
Yes.
of the book, and I'd like to come back.
Okay.
To that. Now, the scope of the book is absolutely gigantic, because you deal with the interaction of U.S. policymakers with France, Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, Russia, Great Britain, Canada, Spain, Italy, the Vatican, the Philippines. And so we want to have the time to cover all those countries. But since we're in France, let us start with a French example. And I have two questions there. It seems to me there are two contradictory things that you address looking at a French case. The first one is the French admiration for Lincoln, which is expressed in a variety of political settings. For instance, Laboulaye, who's a liberal intellectual, and a liberal Catholic, the Comte de Montalembert. So admiration for Lincoln is striking and quite early. And second thing, which is not the same, is the French grand design to regenerate the Latin race in the New World, in installing or in helping Maximilian to come to Mexico, Habsburg, the brother of the Austrian emperor. So could you tell us more about those very different facets of French 19th century politics, the passion for Lincoln and the desire to regenerate the Latin race? What does that mean?
The passion for Lincoln really was not evident completely until his death. And when people just poured out into the streets, students mobilized after one of Laboulaye's lectures that became a eulogy for Lincoln. And they planned to march up the Champs-Élysées to the home of John Bigelow, the newly appointed ambassador to France, and issue a message congratulating America on its victory and expressing solidarity. We are fellow citizens of Abraham Lincoln and John Brown, they told the astonished minister, John Bigelow. And as Bigelow said when he wrote to Seward that night, he said, I had no idea that the young people of France were so taken with Lincoln. And really no one had any idea until that time in April and May. And hundreds of letters poured in from Masonic lodges in France, from workers' groups, from emancipationists, and all kinds of groups that expressed solidarity with America. And so this was something, remember, under the Second Empire, you could not speak openly against the empire or anything to do with with Republican values. You couldn't sing La Marseillaise. You couldn't meet in groups of 20 or more without government permission. Newspapers were censored and so on. But talking about Lincoln and talking about the American Civil War was a way of talking about the Second Empire, about republicanism, about the hopes of the French. And the French liberals, mind you, not the aristocracy and not the imperialists. And so...
He's an aristocrat, so why would he be so interested as well?
He gives this essay that is quickly published, is translated in English and transmitted to America, but it's on the lessons of the victory of the North over the South. And in it, Montalembert, which he's a liberal Catholic, but no one suspected that he was a Republican. But he comes out in this essay and says that we, the French, are, in spite of ourselves, going to become a democratic society, and that this is the future, and this is this victory will change the world. And so it was unexpected. And
so I'd like to come to the question of Mexico, France in Mexico, and you just mentioned Bigelow, who was the minister to France, the U.S. minister to France. Now, Bigelow clearly defends the official line, let's spread Republican ideas all over, but yet he says, I quote him, in your book, the U.S. would prefer Republican government in Mexico, but it would not go to war if the Mexican people wish to have a monarchy. So why did he say that, and why this kind of more than a nuance? If you're for Republican ideas, why would you favor monarchy after all?
Denis, you just put your finger on the wound here. This was a very sensational moment, and it became public. And Bigelow had committed heresy, and there were Democrats in the opposing party. He was a Republican who wanted to have Bigelow fired because he had committed this heresy to say, well, we don't care about whether Mexico, if they elect to have a monarchy, that's okay with us. Bigelow believed that. He believed in this idea, actually propagated by Napoleon III and many French intellectuals, that the Latin race was by temperament, by history, by culture, ill-suited to republicanism. They needed a strong leader, a king that they could revere, or queen, and they needed Catholic moral discipline. and that republicanism eroded and weakened the Latin race, and that's why Mexico had been such a unstable government, and why all of the Latin American republics were failing. And Bigelow said, in a confidential letter to Seward, he said, actually, I don't see anything that gives much promise of success among the Latin American republics. But everyone else believed, in America anyway, the creed was, and among French liberals too, I believe, is that of course we're capable of self-government, government by the people, and that it's a universal principle of human rights and human capacity. And Bigelow had a lot of explaining to do, and it violated the whole idea that this government of Maximilian, even though there was a kind of a plebiscite that approved of Maximilian taking the throne, everyone knew that was a sham, and that this was forced upon Mexico, and that the European emperors, not just in France, but also in Austria and Belgium. Remember Charlotte, Maximilian's wife, was a Belgian. This was a kind of league of conservative monarchs who were trying to impose this European monarch on the ruins of a Mexican republic. So it was, I think Bigelow was the exception that may have proved my general point about the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, now there's this Maximilian enterprise, this astonishing French involvement in Mexico. And here I'd like you to maybe examine the relationship between the uncle and the nephew, Napoleon I and Napoleon III. Don't we have there an ancient Napoleonic ambition, the dream of Napoleon I, which was, and few people know that, his ambition was to create a French colony in Florida or in Louisiana after crushing the slave rebellion in Haiti with 30,000 troops. The idea was that, that would be a short moment, and then I will go to Florida and develop a French colony. Mm-hmm. And of course, that failed miserably. We know what happened. Rochambeau failed miserably, became a prisoner of the British king, and in fact, most of the French troops were killed, or either in guerrilla war or by the yellow fever. So the 30,000 troops led by Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, disaster. So wasn't the nephew trying to outdo the uncle? He failed. I'm going to do better than my uncle, and I will create, starting with Mexico, a kind of French colony or French empire, and then I will show that we can be present there, not just in the north where we were defeated by the British.
Yes. This was, they called it the grand pensée, or grand design of Napoleon III, kind of the major project of his regime. His idea was that he wanted France to be in control to spread Bonapartisme, not just through continental Europe and revive that, but into the American branch of the Latin race, and to control and stabilize Mexico. And Mexico would become the major power in the Western Hemisphere, the Latin Western Hemisphere. And once it was controlled and stable, he wanted to build a canal through Mexico or through Nicaragua, and to create a two-ocean empire that would open up to what is now Vietnam, another new enterprise in the Far East. And that would put the French in control, or at least in a kind of as a tutor of the Latin race in the Americas, and would kind of bring Bonapartisme to its fullest expression as a global idea. Remember, he's also building the Suez Canal that's opening the continent in another direction. So big plans and great ambitions.
Yeah, and speaking of great ambitions and many failures, we know the failure of the Maximilian enterprise, And there's something that's less well known, and there's a fascinating passage in your book, which is the Baghdad raid in 1866. Now, that's in the port city of Matamoros, in the mouth of the Rio Grande. And if I understand well, the Baghdad raid is conducted by freed black U.S. soldiers led by a formerly Confederate colonel, Clay Crawford. And in fact, it raises the question of slavery, former slaves intervening in Mexico to help the Republicans on one side, and on the other side we have, and that's a clandestine, if I understand, operation of the U.S. Army, and on the other side you have Maximilian, who's trying to fight Mexican Republicans with a militia of slaves hired from the Sudan, from Egypt. So clearly the slave question is key there, with surprisingly contradictory things. Freed slave supporting and intervening to support Mexican Republicans, and on the other hand, Maximilian having to resort to, it's not North Korean coming to help the Russian in Ukraine. It's slaves from the Sudan that's supposed to help him. I don't think it took place in the end, but tell us more about this strange, complicated enterprise, the Baghdad raid of 1866.
Yeah, the Baghdad raid, it's a, as you say, a clandestine raid. The American Union soldiers stripped the insignias off their uniforms and came across. And on the border at this time, General Grant had sent in several tens of thousands of colored troops, they called them, black troops that had fought for the Union and were now stationed on the Mexican border in Texas. And they were there to make France pay attention, that if they didn't move out, that there was going to be a war between the United States. And the officials in Washington, Seward and the rest, said, we had no idea, if anything, about this raid. This was not anything that we ordered. But I think they turned a blind eye to what was a rogue action, perhaps, but one that had a good purpose, and that is they raided Baghdad. It was the port, the kind of the nickname for this port, and it had been the lifeline for the Confederacy. The war is over by now, but this is 1866, in fact. And but what astonished the French, and the reports from the French in Mexico say, the U.S. is not going to stop at the border. They're going to come in. They're going to cross the border. They're not afraid of provoking war with France. And that's what changed. That's what warned Napoleon III, I've got to pull out. I can't afford another war. Now, all this time, I should point out that the French opposition, the left in France, had used Mexico to embarrass and undermine public support for the Second Empire. And so this was an embarrassment, and it was a warning sign that it was over.
And what about the strange idea of bringing slaves from the Sudan? I mean,
yes.
Who thought of that?
Maximilian did. He was desperate to uphold his empire. France was the French forces are about 30,000 there, but he couldn't count on them, and he didn't trust the Mexican Imperial Army that he recruited. They were defecting to the Republicans in the north, and so he had Belgian volunteers, others coming in from Africa, and one source were these Sudanese slaves that were, quote, recruited. They were brought over, and Maximilian and others thought these are ideal soldiers. They can take the heat. They could ride up on top of carriages and trains, train cars, and they would fight. And that, again, Seward intervened, and he said, if there's anything that this civil war that we had has resolved, it is that slavery has no place in the civilized world. It must come to an end. And he really put his foot down. That was another warning that some call it the Seward corollary to the Monroe doctrine. And that is that it's not just monarchy, but slavery that no longer belongs in the Western Hemisphere.
After the demise of the Napoleonic empire, failed empire, and Maximilian empire, you write then on the beginning of the French Third Republic and the perceptions of Reconstruction by those Republicans. And you mentioned La Boulaye, but there's also Clemenceau, and that's a very interesting case because he settled in the United States at the time of Reconstruction. He was a correspondent for the journal Le Temps, then came back to France. And you write about Clemenceau's Reconstruction. So what was exactly his understanding of what was going on in the United States at the time? And also, what about the perceptions, which you briefly mentioned, of Victor Hugo, Michelet, describing the same events? So could you tell us a little more about those French intellectuals?
Yeah, this was one of the things that both surprised me and really pleased me because the French intellectuals, the French left, had a reputation for being kind of anti-American. Can you imagine? That's a joke. Lavallee was very pro-American. He was the leading expert on the American Constitution, and he used to say to his students, France has been through 10 different governments since 1789, while America has one. This isn't a weak system of government. It's strong. This is the future. And he was afraid. For a time, he just stopped lecturing on American constitutionalism and went back to a course on Roman law. But when the war broke out, he began to lecture on America, on the main question of the day. Students packed into his lecture hall. And he used current events in America to kind of subversively teach about republicanism. And
during the Second Empire.
During the Second Empire, 1861 is when he began this. He published a wonderful novel called Paris in America about some man who falls asleep, a kind of Rip Van Winkle story, and he wakes up in America and is astonished to find that the government, instead of imposing one religion on people, is actually protecting religious tolerance, religious freedom. And it goes on as a kind of wonderful expose. And he writes it under this real elaborate pen name, and so he's worried about losing his job at the Collège de France.
He republished. What's the name of it again? Paris
in America.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Clemenceau was another one of my just favorite people because he went to America, young medical student, comes from Nantes, and his father was this just flaming radical revolutionary or sympathizer with the revolution. Pictures of Robespierre on the wall in his home, and Clemenceau says he's graduating from medical school at the time that the war ends. He's part of the crowd that comes to Bigelow's house that night. And he decides, I've studied all my life about republicanism, but I've never experienced it. I'm going to America, the one place where the Republican government is operating. He goes over, sets up a place in New York, and lives the life of a young bon vivant in the Lower East Side, and goes to Washington, and he writes articles for French newspapers under a pen name most of the time. And he also teaches French, meets a young American woman, brings her back as his wife, and arrives back in France just in time to see the Prussian War, the Franco-Prussian War, and to be elected as mayor of Montmartre, and the delegate in their assembly. He had an awakening. His lesson from America was that if you have a republic, you've got to accept the winner of the election. A very important lesson that some in America have forgotten. And the communards, they wouldn't accept that the monarchs had won in the legislature of the Third Republic. And Clemenceau did his best to try to keep the peace, but that was his lesson from America.
Actually, by the way, his letters have been republished last year or 2 years ago in a book that's edited by Patrick Veil, so you can find it.
Yes.
And so, but what about Victor Hugo and Michelet?
Yeah.
Is it at about the same time, earlier? Or?
Well, Victor Hugo is, of course, he's in exile. He's living in Guernsey in Britain, and he was just thoroughly upset with Napoleon III's or Louis Napoleon's coup in December 1851, and Le Petit Napoleon was what he called him in a satirical biography. And he just railed at him from outside the country. And there were a lot of my people who were interested in the war and defending the Union who went into exile and spoke from exile. Hugo was one who advocated the idea of a United States of Europe. And I'm not sure he's the one who coined the phrase, but he advocated that in 1848. It gets picked up. Mazzini talks about it. And then a man named Charles Lemonnier, who is the leader of the Congress, the International Congress of Peace. It meets in Geneva. It's a huge congress of over 10,000 people. Garibaldi's there. Marx is there. Thousands of workers and delegates come there to talk about a world that would be based on peace and on representative government. And there's this idea that autocrats cause wars. It's what we call today democratic peace theory. Kings and autocrats, dictators, they take their people to war. They don't have to answer to the people. But elected governments, elected leaders like Lincoln, they have to constantly watch the public. And that's why they thought democracies could not fight wars. You couldn't finish a war. If you couldn't finish a war before your term was up as president, you were finished. Lincoln proved them wrong with that, and that was in November 1864. But these people were, and Michelet, you mentioned, he was one who had been very cynical about America before, but he really comes to see that the country that France had helped give birth to is now giving birth to liberty, the new birth of liberty, if you will, that is now teaching Europe the path to this revival of democratic faith. Keep in mind that since 1848, when the revolutions were crushed, the European left was really in despair, really not very optimistic. And I think the American Civil War, but above all, the victory of the Union and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, I think that just gave a jolt of confidence and a model for the European left that embraced this idea.
Let me consider the case of Spain now and Cuba and Reconstruction. Now, Cuba is complicated. It's a Spanish colony which the Spaniards tried to sell to the United States, which didn't pick it up. And there's this strange political paradox where General Prim, the leader of the liberal revolution in Spain, who deposed Queen Isabella II, expressed a tremendous admiration for the U.S. Constitution to the point that the Spanish Constitution, as you say, reproduces many elements of the American Constitution, the Spanish Constitution then. And you give a number of, the notion of rights, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, so on and so forth. And yet, the Spanish regime at the time is not quite a republic. It's a liberal constitutional monarchy. and a monarchy which is not as liberal as it seems because it maintains slavery in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. So, what's the American influence? It's not Republican, and yet it's the American Constitution, and yet it's a constitutional monarchy. So how do you deal with those complexities? And to go further in the complexity of history, there's a fascinating discussion in your book about Lincoln's influence in Spain, and you oppose two Spanish ministers, Moret, the overseas minister and author of the Moret Bill for the abolition of slavery in Spain, and Castelar, who has a very different reading of Lincoln. I mean, you call that, on the one hand, there's a Castelar's Lincoln, champion of immediate abolition of slavery, and then secondly, Moret's Lincoln, the partisan of gradual emancipation in Spain. So what's the relevance of that debate in Spain and its consequence? The fact that you have those two different approaches by two important politicians, both claim to be influenced by Lincoln and yet draw very different consequences from what Lincoln means in their mind.
Yes, so Lincoln, I found, can serve a lot of different political purposes. Castellar was the leading Republican of Spain and maybe of Europe. He wrote extensively on it. He admired Lincoln and the American model greatly, had a little statue of Lincoln on his desk. Spain also had a really strong pro-slavery lobby. I don't think I realized how strong it was, but they were making money in Cuba. They didn't want to give it up, and again, Spain is the last European country to maintain slavery, and maybe Denmark or something, I think, had kept it until sometime around the same time, 1867. But in any case, Spain's enslaved population in Cuba and Puerto Rico was second only to Brazil's after the emancipation of the U.S. slaves. And they wouldn't let go. And so at the same time that the Spanish overthrow the monarchy, Cuban revolutionaries rise up and declare independence from Spain. And as part of that movement toward independence, they promise freedom to the slaves. So it puts pressure on Spain to act. And the U.S., under Hamilton Fish, who's probably the most conservative figure in the Republican Party, an old New York aristocrat, but strongly anti-slavery. And he said, you've got to come to terms with this. Slavery is finished. And if you don't, he said, we're going to recognize the rebels in Cuba. You don't want to do that, but we will. There's tremendous popular pressure in America to do that, and you've got to act. So Spain goes through this slow, dragging their feet, and they finally get into a long debate in the spring of 1870. And this wonderful debate that carries on. Castelar gets up and speaks for, a day and a half in front of the Cortes, and just exclaims, how in America, Lincoln showed the way, that, he lifted these men up who were formerly slaves and could not even read or write, and now look at them, they're now holding office in Congress and owning land, and they are equals in the sight of the law, and we must emancipate our slaves all at once, totally, and we must make them equal, just as the Americans have. And Moret answers, if Lincoln had had his way, the slaves would still be enslaved until sometime around 1895 or sometime in the 1890s. It's true that Lincoln had offered gradual emancipation. The Spanish law was what they call the free womb law. All children of slave mothers would be free, and so it would happen very slowly. It was a concession to the slaveholding interests in Spain and Cuba. On the 4th of July, Spain promulgated this law to free the slaves, And slowly or not, slavery was put on the road to extinction. Brazil followed suit very quickly. As one senator said, we didn't want the world laughing at us if we were the last ones. And so Brazil also passed a free womb law. And then Fish keeps up the pressure, and in 1873, Spain abolishes outright and completely slavery in Puerto Rico. So it's on the way out. After 4 centuries of African slavery in America.
Before asking my last question, let's see, I lost, England, I think it's important to say a word about England with a very different reading of what happened in the United States, and with a distortion, I understand, of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is poorly translated in English by Reeves, and which, in fact, subverts the real meaning of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. But I'd like to get the example of Disraeli. Disraeli perhaps was influenced by his reading of Tocqueville, but he doesn't like the American model of democracy, and he doesn't like Lincoln in particular. And so he says, if we import the American model, as described by Tocqueville, that would turn England into, quote, from a first-rate kingdom into a third-rate republic controlled by the raging demagogue of the hour. And paradoxically, Disraeli then will pass the Reform Act of 1867, which expands tremendously the universal male suffrage. So it's a path towards limited, but a path toward democracy.
Yes.
So how is someone who dislikes so much the American system, in fact, passes this reform which goes in a direction of more democracy, to the point that John Motley, who's the American minister to London, would describe that Reform Act of 1867 as, quote, the fruit of the Appomattox apple tree.
Yeah.
A wonderful quote, but
Yes.
Replace it in the context.
Yes.
And why is this? And was Disraeli really unsympathetic to the American experience, even though he was pushing laws that seemed to be pro-American, given the context of the time?
Yes. Inside Parliament, they're debating on the virtues and vices of democracy, each of them using America as an example for robust democracy and government by the people that is resilient and good and prosperous, and so, and others saying, like, it's a mess over there, and we can't have that. Outside Parliament, the Reform League, this coalition of middle class, but mostly workers, organized by the International Working Men's Association, led by Karl Marx, or he was one that. The Reform League is it's a, I would say, not a communist organization, but it's a coalition movement in which the International Working Men's Association, the first international, was heavily involved, and they were organizing massively. Hundreds of thousands of people were turning out in Trafalgar Square, and just demonstrating with their bodies that. They wanted the vote, and they deserved the vote, and they'd gather and listen to speeches. So it was public pressure, in short, that bore down on Disraeli and his government. And I think the key to understanding Britain is that they do just enough reform to not become, to not light the fuse of revolution. They want to avoid the French model, if you will, of 1789. And so they, inch by inch, slow, incremental reform. But this law of 1867, the Second Reform Act, it doubles the size of the electorate. And then in 83, it expands again. And the working class is now, most of them are enfranchised. They're able to vote. Marx said that instead of just striking or planning on going to the barricades, workers had to conquer political power. And this was the way he did it. He was actually, for a moment, Marx becomes a democratic socialist.
Yeah, and you keep comparing the working class to the blacks in America.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lastly, maybe a more general question. What was America's real influence? Are we talking, in reading your book, of a cause and effect type of influence? Or are we just talking about convergence of ideas and interests, something which would be closer to l'air du temps, the mood of the moment? Couldn't we argue that liberal democracy was not really imported from the United States? It was the topic of the moment, a matter of fashion, the fashionable political regime everyone wanted to adopt throughout the world, irrespective of the American experience.
Yes, I think that's exactly the way people like Mazzini and Victor Hugo and others would describe it. That this is, it's a popular idea. It's with the will of the people. Everyone wants to live in a free society and elect their own government. If only the yoke of tyranny could be lifted. I mean, it may be naive, but that was, I think, the general view of liberals, of leftists, and so the American Civil War and Lincoln, they become convenient and practical models of success. And that's what the left is looking for. It becomes as I said, after 1848, there weren't many models of success in Europe for democratic republics. Switzerland was one, but there weren't many others.
Yeah, last point. About the last chapter, you call it the coda, the undoing. In fact, it's a sad ending to your book because you end up with the rise of white supremacy, American imperialism, a new birth of white supremacy, as you put it, a rediscovery at the Dunning School of understanding Reconstruction. And since we're facing today a very tense, very difficult presidential election, I'd like you to retell us the real end of Reconstruction, namely the 1876 presidential election opposing Tilden to Hayes, which was incredibly tight. The two leading parties had almost the same number of votes in the Electoral College. So what happened then? And in retelling the story, what was the European reaction to the amazing compromise reached by the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, in 1876? Did Europeans realize the significance of Home Rule and what it would imply as the end of Reconstruction and beginning of Jim Crow?
I didn't, to be honest, I didn't study that nearly as much as I should have. But it was, I think that those Europeans who were interpreting Reconstruction, for example, James Bryce, who was kind of the main focus, he's a British academic, a historian at Oxford, writes the book, The American Commonwealth, and he explains the demise of Reconstruction and its failure as an example of why it was a mistake. He adopts the Dunning School view that Reconstruction was a mistake because it was based on the idea of racial equality, and that to give over to formerly enslaved Africans the right to govern themselves was like letting a child run a locomotive. And as I said, this was the ascending interpretation of Reconstruction and its failure, and the defining thrust behind Jim Crow. And it is a sad ending.
But what about Tilden and Hayes? It resembles, I mean, it's an election where it's so tight that,
yes.
In fact, the Congress has to decide.
Yes.
And the vote is the majority by one vote for the Democrats or for the Republicans?
For the Republicans, but
right.
they
So
concede.
What's the compromise?
The compromise is to withdraw the troops and essentially to let the South go, but not entirely
provided that the Republican gets the presidency, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But
Deal.
Reconstruction doesn't really end until the 1890s, and that's when they develop new laws that bypass racial exclusion, they used laws of educational tests to read and write and to understand the Constitution. And that was the key to the undoing of Reconstruction.
The federal troops made a big difference. No?
Yes, it did.
And that was 1876.
Yeah, because you could not have free and fair elections without an armed guard at the elections. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Does anybody have a burning question? Fred?
Yes, thank you very much for this extremely interesting discussion. So I'd like to ask a question about a passing remark that was made because, okay, so you mentioned that Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, that the translation that was done by someone was not a good one and it turned the meaning on its head. And so is that the English translation we have now? What then is, so can you remind us then very quickly, what was the message of that book and how was it turned on its head by this translation?
Reeves, I think his name was Henry Reeves, but don't.
Reeves, right.
Yeah, Reeves, for sure. He was, he had translated the book in the 1850s sometime, and de Tocqueville was, when he was still alive, said, "That's not what I meant," and he warned him. But it's, it was in print, and it had an influence on British thinking about the dangers of the tyranny of the majority was one of the things. And I don't remember exactly the passage or passages and what Reeves did, but it was, as Tocqueville saw, it was misconstrued. And
because Tocqueville was reading The Federalist, in fact. Tocqueville is citing Madison on the tyranny, the possible tyranny of the majority.
Yes. And but that had a big impact. James Bryce, the one I mentioned earlier, he challenges Tocqueville afterwards, and argues, the reason Tocqueville didn't understand American democracy was because he was French. This is an Anglo-American creation, he argues, and he's imbued with these theories about the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon tradition of self-government, that democracy comes out of the Teutonic mark, the town, local self-government, and that if you're not Anglo-Saxon, I'm sorry, you just don't have the kind of experience that British and their colonists in America and Canada, Australia, and so on, that they have been born with. And so
by the way, it's exactly what Tocqueville says. So he misread. Tocqueville says, in the rise of equality throughout centuries, that equality starts in the wood of Germany. And he cites Tacitus. So it's, in fact, it's Tocqueville and Bancroft reading of the rise of equality throughout the world. It starts in the wood of Germany.
Yes, the woods are, yes. Uh-huh. And I think, though, what Bryce would say is that it becomes more the exclusive property and merit of the Anglo-Saxons. And this idea of Anglo-Saxon supremacy, as distinguished from general white supremacy, it has impact on immigration restriction in the 1890s, keeping out Eastern and Southern Europeans who are seen as in the same light. This is a concern mainly of Northerners who use almost the same language as the Southerners do about, we can't let these, immigrant hordes coming in and, destroying our democracy. So the rise of racism veiled as scientific theory had a poisonous effect on American democracy and world democracy.
All right, we have time for one more question.
In terms of indigenous peoples in America at the time, some of them cooperated with the French. Did Lincoln have any plan to either exploit the indigenous people for the Reconstruction, or to watch them, or what was the whole link with the indigenous people? Thank you.
That is not a proud part of America's history, north or south. You know, some of the southern tribes actually joined the Confederacy. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the U.S. Army went out to essentially to remove the Indians, either by, moving them into reservations or by genocide. It's a really shameful part of the history, and I know that's a that's a blot on Reconstruction, and it was. It fit in with this kind of rising tide of scientific racism. And it's, I have no excuse for that, and I don't have any respect for that part of Reconstruction or Americans' democracy. Excuse me.
All right, I think we do have more time. One more. Yeah, was there a hand over here? You have a question, great.
One thing I've always grappled with in studying American history is the perplexing change in the radical Republicans. In the 1860s, they pushed through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And in 1876, they sold their souls for power. What happened?
It's a good question. The party evolved. Some of the veterans of the 1860s die out literally and lose power, and a new generation comes in, and they become persuaded by these ideas of race. I think not necessarily toward blacks, but toward immigrants, Chinese, Indians, and so on. Race is the enemy. It's the opposite of democracy. It's the opposite of the ideals of equality and opportunity for all. And it's just a powerful poison for democracy. And I think that affected them. And also the Republicans became the party of the railroads and big business. And that was not always in alignment with the ideals of the Civil War generation. But during this time, in the 1860s and up into the 1870s, that radical Republican movement, it changed the nation. It was a revolutionary and really, I think, an admirable moment, and one that Republicans ought to be very proud of.